In the late 1990s, Britain was still built on quiet trust. In towns like Hyde, just outside Manchester, doctors weren't just healers. They were pillars of the community. People trusted their doctor more than their banker, their lawyer, even their priest. And no one in Hyde carried more respect than Dr. Harold Shipman. He seemed the very picture of professionalism. Calm, dependable, old-fashioned in the best way. He dressed neatly, spoke softly, and made time for everyone. He visited patients at home, checked in on the elderly, and remembered names, birthdays, and small details that made people feel safe. In an age of rushed appointments, Shipman felt like the last of a dying kind, a doctor who truly cared. Born in 1946 in Nottingham, Harold Frederick Shipman grew up under the watchful eye of his mother, Vera. She adored him, and he adored her. When she developed lung cancer during his teenage years, young Harold watched as her doctor administered morphine injections to ease her pain. He saw how the drug gave her calm before death, how power over life and death sat quietly in the doctor's hands. That moment would shape him forever. He went on to study medicine at Leeds University, graduating in 1970. Early on, he was ambitious, precise, and confident, perhaps too confident. But within 5 years of becoming a general practitioner, cracks began to show. In 1975, he was caught forging prescriptions for pethidine, a strong painkiller similar to morphine. He claimed it was for patients. In truth, it was for himself. He was fined, briefly suspended, and quietly sent for rehabilitation. Then, as if nothing had happened, he returned to medicine. His colleagues believed he had changed. Patients welcomed him back with open arms. No one imagined that a man once punished for drug misuse would soon use those same substances for something far darker. By the 1980s, Shipman had established himself as Hyde's most trusted doctor. He opened his own practice and treated hundreds of patients, many of them elderly women who adored him. He visited them in their homes, drank their tea, and listened to their stories. They trusted him completely, and they died believing they were in safe hands. But beneath the calm surface, something had shifted. Shipman had begun to experiment again, quietly, secretly, carefully. The same morphine that had eased his mother's pain had now become his instrument of control. Death, when delivered by him, was peaceful, undetectable, almost merciful. Over the next 2 decades, patients in Hyde died at an unusual rate. Each time, the cause seemed natural: heart failure, old age, respiratory collapse. No one questioned the man who signed the certificates. Why would they? He was the doctor. But in 1998, one death, that of a wealthy widow named Kathleen Grundy, would expose everything. Her passing looked ordinary, like so many before. Yet her daughter noticed something strange, and with that, the facade began to crumble. In June 1998, Kathleen Grundy was found dead at her home in Hyde. She was 81, independent, respected, and known for her energy. She had spent the morning volunteering at a local charity, speaking cheerfully with neighbors before returning home. Hours later, she was gone. Her death certificate listed the cause as old age. The doctor who signed it was, of course, Harold Shipman. To everyone in town, it made sense. She was elderly. She'd lived a full life. And if Dr. Shipman said it was natural, then it was. Few people in Hyde would have dared to doubt him. But Kathleen's daughter, Angela Woodruff, wasn't convinced. She was a solicitor, sharp-minded and skeptical by nature. When a local solicitor contacted her about her mother's will, Angela was confused. Her mother had written a will years earlier, a simple one, leaving her estate to her children. This new will, however, was different. It left almost $400,000, her entire estate, to Dr. Harold Shipman. The wording was clumsy, the signature awkward. Angela immediately sensed something was wrong. Her mother would never have done such a thing. Angela went to the police, but it wasn't easy convincing them. After all, this was Dr. Shipman, a man loved by the community. He'd delivered babies, comforted widows, and attended countless funerals. The very idea that he could be involved in foul play seemed absurd. Still, Angela pressed on. She provided the will, her mother's medical records, and letters as evidence. The coroner agreed to open an inquiry. In August 1998, investigators made a decision that would change everything. They ordered Kathleen Grundy's body to be exhumed. What they found confirmed Angela's worst fear. Toxicology results revealed a lethal dose of morphine in Kathleen's system, far beyond what could ever be prescribed for treatment. It wasn't natural death. It was murder. Detectives began to dig deeper into Shipman's past patients. The pattern emerged almost instantly. Elderly women, most dying suddenly, often shortly after a visit from their trusted doctor. The cause of death was always the same: heart failure or old age. And there was one more connection. Nearly all of them had been cremated, leaving no trace behind. Police searched Shipman's home and office. Inside, they found forged medical records, death certificates he had altered, and, crucially, a Brother typewriter, the exact model used to create Kathleen Grundy's fake will. The evidence began to pile up. The perfect doctor, the man who cared for the town's elderly, had built his entire reputation on silence and death. Each forged signature, each quiet cremation, each peaceful passing had been part of his design. But still, many refused to believe it. To them, Harold Shipman wasn't a killer. He was a savior. He had delivered their children, cared for their parents, buried their friends. The idea that he could be a murderer felt like blasphemy. For the police, though, there was no turning back. The investigation into Dr. Shipman had officially begun, and soon the scale of his crimes would shock an entire nation. By late 1998, the quiet town of Hyde no longer trusted its own reflection. Rumors spread in whispers, at church gatherings, at cafes, outside the post office. How could Dr. Shipman be under investigation? People asked. He's treated my mother for years. But behind the closed doors of Greater Manchester Police, investigators were beginning to see a pattern too disturbing to ignore. Detective Superintendent Bernard Postles led the inquiry. His team began cross-checking thousands of medical records signed by Shipman. The first clue was the frequency of deaths, far higher than any other doctor in the area. Then came the timing. Many patients had died shortly after routine visits. Others were discovered dead within hours of Shipman's departure. They compiled a list of over 150 suspicious cases, all certified by the same man. Each file told a similar story: an elderly woman living alone, in seemingly good health, dying suddenly, and then cremated before any questions could be asked. Shipman's confidence had been his camouflage. He knew no one would suspect the man who signed the death certificate. Forensic experts began examining his handwritten notes. They noticed something chilling. Shipman often edited patient records after they died, adding details to justify why he had visited them before their death. The computer logs didn't lie. The edits always came after the date of death. Police also uncovered something even more damning. He had been stockpiling diamorphine, medical-grade heroin used in hospitals for severe pain. In the wrong hands, it was lethal. Shipman had signed it out under false pretenses, keeping vials hidden away. While detectives built their case, Shipman continued working as though nothing had changed. He saw patients daily, smiling, shaking hands, prescribing medicine. He knew the police were circling, yet his composure never cracked. When officers finally called him in for questioning, he was polite, even amused. They asked why Kathleen Grundy's will left him all her money. He calmly said she was grateful for his help. When they mentioned the morphine found in her body, he dismissed it. It must have been natural, but his confidence couldn't last forever. Police obtained a warrant to access his computer records. What they found destroyed his defense. Dozens of falsified medical entries, forged documents, and evidence of systematic manipulation going back years. Each digital footprint painted a picture of deliberate, organized murder. When confronted with the data, Shipman showed no remorse, no panic, no denial. He simply said, "You're mistaken." But investigators weren't. The pattern was undeniable. By September 1998, Harold Shipman was arrested for the murder of Kathleen Grundy and forgery of her will. Still, no one, not even the police, fully grasped the true scale of his crimes. What began as one suspicious death was about to unravel into one of the darkest revelations in medical history. By the winter of 1999, the eyes of Britain turned toward the Manchester Crown Court. The name Harold Shipman had already become a symbol of betrayal. A doctor accused of murdering the very people who trusted him most. Outside the courthouse, reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, their cameras aimed at the entrance. Inside, rows of families, sons, daughters, grandchildren, sat in tense silence. Many still couldn't believe that their kind family doctor could be capable of such horror. Shipman entered the courtroom wearing a calm expression. Dressed neatly, glasses polished, hands clasped, he looked like a man about to attend a lecture, not a trial for murder. His composure unsettled everyone. He didn't fidget, didn't look around, didn't show a hint of fear. The prosecution began with the case of Kathleen Grundy, the former mayor of Hyde. Her forged will, leaving everything to Shipman, had sparked the entire investigation. The prosecutor, Richard Henriquez QC, stood before the jury and declared, "This is not a case of medical error. It is a case of calculated murder, deliberate, cold, and repeated." Over the following weeks, the courtroom heard the details, one by one, of 15 deaths linked to Shipman. Each story was similar: a patient alone with him, a sudden injection, a swift death, and a forged record claiming natural causes. Witnesses described his unusual behavior, how he insisted on being alone with patients during visits, how he discouraged families from attending appointments, how he often recommended cremation, and how he personally handled the paperwork. Then came the forensic evidence. The toxicology reports revealed lethal levels of diamorphine in the bodies of several victims, the same drug Shipman had secretly obtained from medical supplies. Computer experts demonstrated how he tampered with medical records immediately after each death, adding false symptoms to justify his presence. Throughout the trial, Shipman sat motionless. No tears, no anger, no regret. He often stared straight ahead, as though the proceedings were beneath him. When his lawyer suggested he testify in his own defense, he refused. The defense tried to argue that the deaths were coincidental, elderly patients dying of natural causes. But the digital timestamps, the falsified records, and the forged will told another story. A story of meticulous manipulation. As weeks turned into months, the families of the victims grew restless. They wanted answers, but none came. Shipman never spoke a word of explanation. Then, on January 31, 2000, the jury returned its verdict. After 6 days of deliberation, Harold Shipman was found guilty of 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery. The judge, Mr. Justice Forbes, called him wicked beyond belief. He sentenced Shipman to life imprisonment, recommending that he never be released. Outside the courtroom, the air was thick with disbelief. Reporters called him Dr. Death. Families wept, not only for the victims, but for the hundreds of unanswered questions that still lingered. Because even as Shipman began his life sentence, investigators suspected the number of victims might not be 15. It could be dozens, perhaps even hundreds. The trial had ended, but the true horror of Harold Shipman was only beginning to surface. When the courtroom doors closed behind Harold Shipman, the world believed justice had been served. But in the quiet halls of police headquarters in Manchester, a new question began to echo. How many people did he really kill? Investigators realized that Shipman's crimes might stretch far beyond the 15 murders proven in court. His career had spanned more than 2 decades, first as a hospital intern, then as a general practitioner in the town of Hyde. Thousands of patients had passed through his care. Detective Bernard Posels, who led the investigation, ordered a full review of Shipman's patient records. What they uncovered was chilling. There were hundreds of certificates of death, all signed by Shipman himself, many for patients who had died suddenly, without witnesses, and always at home. The pattern was unmistakable: a quiet afternoon visit, a swift death, and a note claiming heart failure or stroke. Shipman's methods were frighteningly consistent. He would inject his victims with a lethal dose of diamorphine, watch them slip into unconsciousness, and calmly leave, often telling relatives it was peaceful. He didn't kill for money. Most of the time, there was no clear motive. Experts later speculated that it was about control, power, and perhaps the twisted satisfaction of playing God. In early 2001, a formal public inquiry was launched, led by Dame Janet Smith. Her task was monumental: to review over 20 years of death records and determine just how many lives had been taken. The inquiry revealed a staggering truth. Shipman was linked to at least 215 suspicious deaths and possibly more than 250. Most victims were elderly women, living alone, who trusted their doctor completely. But there were also younger patients, even a man in his 40s, showing that age was never truly the deciding factor. Each discovery brought another wave of grief. Families realized their loved ones' peaceful deaths had been carefully staged murders. One woman said through tears, "He killed my mother, and I thanked him for being so kind." It was a betrayal unlike any other in British medical history. The government soon began questioning how one man could commit so many murders without raising alarms. How could he prescribe so much morphine without oversight? Why did no one notice the pattern? Hospitals and local authorities faced harsh criticism for failing to monitor death certificates and prescription records. Shipman had exploited a system built entirely on trust, and that trust became his weapon. In prison, Shipman remained silent. He refused all interviews, ignored letters, and declined to explain his motives. Psychiatrists who studied him described him as narcissistic, controlling, and remorseless. He saw himself as above judgment, even from the law. By the time the inquiry concluded, the name Harold Shipman had become synonymous with medical evil. The final report estimated that he might have killed more people than any serial killer in modern history. And yet, the most haunting part of his story was not the number of deaths, but the silence that surrounded them. For decades, His victims had been hidden behind polite medical notes, comforting smiles, and quiet funerals. He was not a monster hiding in the shadows. He was a doctor, standing in plain sight. When the full scale of Harold Shipman's crimes was revealed, Britain's trust in its most sacred institution, the medical profession, was shattered. Doctors were supposed to heal, to comfort, to preserve life. But Shipman had weaponized that trust, turning the symbol of care into a cloak for death. The nation wanted answers. How could one man murder hundreds of people under the government's nose for over 20 years? The truth was brutal in its simplicity. The system had failed. At the time, there were few mechanisms to detect abnormal death patterns. General practitioners worked with autonomy, signing death certificates with minimal scrutiny. If a patient died at home, the attending doctor could certify the cause of death without question. And since Shipman's patients were mostly elderly, his explanations, heart attack, stroke, old age, raised no alarm. His charm completed the illusion. Patients adored him. He was the caring local doctor, the man who made house calls, who took time to listen, who sent sympathy cards to grieving families. To the community, Harold Shipman wasn't suspicious. He was beloved. But behind his calm demeanor, he was exploiting a perfect loophole. He kept meticulous handwritten records that always justified his medical actions, even when they didn't make sense. No digital systems, no oversight, no second opinions. Just Shipman and the trust of an entire town. When detectives compared his prescribing patterns to other doctors in the area, the numbers were staggering. Shipman had ordered 10 times more diamorphine than any of his peers. Yet no one had questioned it. Pharmacies, coroners, hospitals, all had assumed he was simply a busy doctor caring for terminal patients. It was the kind of blind faith that can only exist in a system unaccustomed to betrayal. Dame Janet Smith's inquiry didn't just expose Shipman's crimes, it exposed a national vulnerability. The report revealed systemic weaknesses that allowed Shipman's behavior to go unchecked. No national system for monitoring prescriptions, no database tracking sudden deaths linked to a single practitioner, and a culture that discouraged questioning a doctor's authority. The findings were damning. As one investigator later remarked, if Harold Shipman had been an accountant, he might have been caught after one fraud. But as a doctor, he was trusted to the very end. In Parliament, debates raged about reforming the National Health Service. Families of victims demanded accountability, holding photos of mothers, fathers, and grandparents who had trusted their killer. The government soon established the Shipman inquiry reforms, introducing strict medical oversight, digital death certification, prescription monitoring, and mandatory audits of controlled drugs. The medical profession itself had to look inward. The image of the untouchable doctor was gone forever. In Hyde, where the murders took place, the shock turned to guilt. Many residents confessed they had noticed something odd: the frequency of funerals, the whispered rumors, the fact that Shipman's patients never seemed to live long. But no one wanted to believe it. After all, he was Dr. Shipman. That was perhaps his most chilling victory. He didn't just murder individuals, he murdered trust itself. In the autumn of 1999, Harold Shipman's world began to collapse, not in a flash of guilt or moral awakening, but under the steady weight of evidence. For 2 decades, he had lived as though untouchable, confident, composed, and convinced of his own righteousness. Even as the police built their case, Shipman walked into interviews with the calm of a man who still believed in his own myth. To investigators, it was chilling. He showed no remorse, no anxiety. only irritation that his reputation was being questioned. When asked about the forged will of Kathleen Grundy, he insisted it was a mistake. When confronted with the morphine traces in her body, he coolly suggested natural causes. Every question met a wall of arrogance, not fear. Detectives quickly learned that Shipman didn't just want control over his patients. He wanted to play God. He decided when they would live, when they would die, and how they would be remembered. He chose his victims carefully, mostly elderly women, those who trusted him implicitly and whose deaths would raise the least suspicion. But even gods make mistakes. When police examined his computer, they found digital records altered after his patients' deaths, false notes typed in to match his cover stories. It was the kind of carelessness that only comes from years of invincibility. For the first time, the illusion cracked. By early 2000, the prosecution had built an unbreakable case. 15 confirmed murders, each supported by toxicology, forged records, or falsified documents. The courtroom was packed. Families of the victims sat in silence, clutching photos of loved ones. Reporters filled every seat, eager to capture the downfall of Britain's most trusted doctor turned mass murderer. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, Shipman refused to stand. He looked forward, unblinking, his expression flat. To the very end, he denied everything. He offered no apology, no confession, no closure. In his mind, he was still right, and everyone else wrong. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Shipman was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the judge recommending he never be released. The once beloved doctor left the courtroom not as a man of medicine, but as a national symbol of deception, a warning carved into the conscience of Britain. In the months that followed, psychologists studied his case, desperate to understand how a man sworn to heal could derive satisfaction from killing. Some called him a sociopath, others a narcissist with a god complex so severe that empathy no longer existed in his mind. But perhaps the most haunting theory was the simplest. Shipman believed he was helping, ending suffering, delivering peace. And that delusion made him far more dangerous than any monster who knew he was one. Inside prison, he remained cold, detached, and silent. He refused all therapy, all interviews. When journalists tried to reach him, they received the same reply: Dr. Shipman does not wish to comment. For a man who had once controlled life and death with a pen and a needle, the silence of confinement was the ultimate punishment. Inside Wakefield Prison, Harold Shipman became inmate number C1139. The man who once held the lives of an entire community in his hands was now reduced to a number, a shadow moving through the cold routines of confinement. No medical charts, no white coat, no patients to manipulate. Just four walls, silence, and time. Endless, unrelenting time. Even among murderers, Shipman stood apart. He didn't fit the profile of the typical criminal. No drugs, no gangs, no chaos. He was educated, articulate, and disturbingly calm. Other inmates called him the Doctor. Some avoided him altogether. Others whispered that he didn't belong there, that he looked like a man still planning his next appointment. Guards reported that he remained polite, punctual, and eerily composed. He never raised his voice, never argued, never asked for favors. But beneath that composure was something darker, a man who refused to acknowledge guilt. When offered counseling, he declined. When invited to meet victims' families, he turned away. To the end, Harold Shipman insisted he was innocent. But in the stillness of prison life, something began to erode. The arrogance that had once sustained him was slowly crushed by isolation. His family, once loyal, began to distance themselves. His wife, Primrose, stopped visiting as often. Their children, humiliated by the press, tried to disappear from public view. For a man who had built his life around control, that loss of influence was unbearable. In January 2004, at exactly 6:20 a.m., a guard found Shipman hanging in his cell. He had used bed sheets to fashion a noose attached to the window bars. He was 57 years old. The nation's response was divided. Some felt relief that justice had been served in the only way left. Others felt cheated that the man who had taken so many lives had escaped the full weight of justice. For the families of his victims, there was no closure, only silence where answers should have been. The government launched another review, examining how even in custody, Shipman's psychological state went unnoticed. But the truth was simpler. No one could control Harold Shipman, not his patients, not the police, not the courts, and not the system that finally contained him. In death, as in life, he had chosen his own ending. In Hyde, memorials to the victims were built quietly. Streets that once echoed with trust now carried a ghostly kind of sorrow. The medical center where Shipman had practiced was demolished, replaced by a garden of remembrance. Each flower there symbolized a life once trusted to a doctor who believed he was untouchable. His story remains one of the darkest chapters in modern British history, not just because of what he did, but because of how easily he did it. It wasn't murder in the shadows, but in the daylight, behind a smile, a handshake, and a prescription pad. And perhaps the most haunting truth of all, Harold Shipman wasn't a monster from birth. He was what happens when power meets ego, when trust meets temptation, and when a man forgets that healing and killing are separated by the thinnest of lines. In the years after Harold Shipman's death, Britain was left to confront a question that no one wanted to ask. How many lives did he really take? The official inquiry estimated at least 215 confirmed murders, but many investigators believed the real number was far higher, perhaps closer to 250. That made him not only the most prolific serial killer in British history, but one of the deadliest the world had ever seen. Yet even as statistics were debated, what lingered most was the emotional aftermath, the quiet devastation left in living rooms, in hospitals, in hearts. Each victim had a name, a story, a family who trusted the very person who betrayed them. And that betrayal didn't end with death. It rippled through generations, shaping how Britain viewed medicine, trust, and authority itself. The government responded with sweeping reforms. Every prescription, every death certificate, every medical decision became part of a monitored system designed to ensure that what happened in Hyde could never happen again. The Shipman inquiry had become a blueprint for how to rebuild a nation's faith in its doctors. But beyond the policies and reports, something deeper changed: the relationship between doctor and patient. Where there had once been unquestioning faith, there was now awareness. Patients began to ask more questions, families began to stay present during treatment, and medicine, once shrouded in quiet reverence, became transparent, accountable, and watched. For the people of Hyde, time has softened the shock, but not erased it. The town lives on in quiet dignity, its beauty now intertwined with its history. A bronze plaque near the memorial garden reads simply, "In memory of those who trusted." To this day, criminologists and psychologists still debate what drove Shipman: greed, ego, or something darker. Some argue he sought control over life and death itself. Others believe he killed out of a twisted sense of mercy. But the truth, like his victims, was buried with him, unreachable, unspoken. In the end, Harold Shipman's name became more than a headline. It became a warning, a reminder that evil doesn't always come with blood on its hands or madness in its eyes. Sometimes it wears a stethoscope, smiles kindly, and tells you to trust it. And so, every medical reform, every audit, every safety measure that followed carries his shadow, not as a tribute, but as a guardrail against complacency. Because in the quiet town of Hyde, one doctor proved a truth humanity can never afford to forget, that even the most trusted hands can kill, and that vigilance, not faith, must be the price of safety.